Hello again. This is Mr. Burnett, and today we're going to talk about political parties. All right. So in a way, this is a continuation of our last lecture. I know that one focused on citizens' civic duties, voting, elections. And this is really a continuation of that one in the terms that it talks about how our system actually works. We spent most of this year talking about what our system looks like on paper, talking about the Constitution, obviously, a lot, and how the actual structure of the government is set up. And these last lectures are really going to focus on okay, it's one thing for the Constitution to explain we have three branches and Congress is bicameral and all those sort of things. But how does that play out in real life? And that's what these lectures are about. And today's lecture is going to be on political parties. I suspect this lecture is going to be quite a bit shorter than our last one. So let's just get into it. Now, as you see here, and you probably recognize those symbols. If not, those are the symbols that represent our two primary political parties in this country. The elephant is for the Republicans, the donkey is for the Democrats. Those symbols came about through political cartoons back in the 1800s, and the symbols have stuck ever since. Now, a little bit of a history lesson here before we talk about modern political parties. America's first political parties began in George Washington's cabinet. All right, so this may be a little bit of a review from your 8th grade history class. But as you may remember, George Washington, in his farewell address, warned people, the country, not to have political parties. He thought they would be divisive, and he was afraid that once you have political parties, people's loyalty is towards the parties and not to the country itself. Obviously, the country did not take that advice, and what is ironic about it is that the first political parties really came about within his own cabinet. He had a small cabinet, just Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of, back then it was called Secretary of War, Secretary of State, and then an Attorney General. Well, Jefferson was his Secretary of State, Hamilton was his Secretary of Treasury, and they really had very different views as to how the country should be formed, how the government should operate. And it was their arguments within Washington's own cabinet that really set the ground for the first political parties. Jefferson's party that grew up around him was called the Democratic Republicans, or sometimes we just see them called the Republicans. The party that grew up around Hamilton were called the Federalists, and they grew out of Washington's cabinet. Now, today, the two main parties are the Republicans and the Democrats. There are other smaller parties, but the Republicans and Democrats are the ones that won the overwhelming majority of elections. For instance, there are 100 senators. I believe 99 of them are either Republicans or Democrats, and one is kind of technically an independent, but that's Bernie Sanders, who every 4 years runs for president as a Democrat, so you can question whether he's truly independent or not. So basically, virtually every major politician that wins elections in this country is a Republican or a Democrat. There are other parties, the Green Party, the Libertarian Party. The Libertarian Party is probably in terms of most profile, or at least the most adherence to its philosophy comes in third. The Libertarian Party is kind of a mix of Democrat and Republican. They tend to be like Democrats on social issues. They really don't think the government has any role in our lives, or they don't think the government should have any or little role in our lives. So they tend to agree with Democrats on social issues. The government shouldn't regulate who you can and can't marry. They shouldn't regulate abortions. But then they tend to mirror Republicans on business issues. They don't think the government should take a very active hand in regulating businesses or having tariffs, things like that. So the Libertarian Party is kind of a hybrid between the two ideologies, between the Republicans and Democrats, but they finish a very, very distant third in almost all elections. All right, so why do we have political parties? Well, what's their purpose? I don't know, Washington said they're a bad idea, but we've pretty much had them nonstop since he left office. Well, why? Well, there must be something to them if we continue to use them for now 230 years. One, they help us select candidates. All right, as we just got through here in the spring of 2020, before coronavirus kind of shut down a little bit of the election season, there are primary elections. We talked about this in our last election. You may have your election in November between one Democrat candidate and one Republican candidate, but first the parties have to help select candidates. So they have primary elections, usually about 6-8 months before the main election, so that each party is putting up one candidate for office. Because otherwise, it could get pretty chaotic. If you didn't have parties to whittle down the candidates, you may have 20, 25 candidates running for office. And if you think back to our lesson on electoral college, let's just take presidents. Let's say you had 20 people running for president, and they weren't affiliated with any party. You just simply had 20 names on the ballot. Well, what's going to happen is every state, first of all, no one's going to get a huge percentage of the vote. You're going to have people getting 5, 10, 15%. You may have a situation where a candidate, quote, wins an election with only 15% of voters voting for him or her. And so most people's votes are going to be ignored in that sense. Ignored is probably not the right word, but most people's 85% of the people voted for someone else, and yet this person only had 15% of the votes going to, quote unquote, win the election. But as we've seen in the Electoral College, you have to have 270 Electoral College votes to become president. Otherwise, the House of Representatives picks the president. And what would happen if you had 20 or 25 people running with no party affiliation? One person may win Texas, a second person may win New York, a third person wins Florida, a fourth person wins California, and you'd end up with nobody getting anywhere close to 50% of the Electoral College votes. So every election would come down to the House of Representatives selecting the president. All right, and so if you don't like the Electoral College system, if you think that's anti-democratic, imagine if every presidential election was chosen by Congress, and the people really didn't get any say. It was all members of Congress selecting the candidates. And you see some of this in other countries. Other countries where instead of having two main political parties, there might be 7, 8, 9, 10 fairly major political parties. I think Spain is like this, and I don't know their status up to date as I'm sitting here recording this on Cinco de Mayo 2020, but for the last few years, Spain has been unable to form a government because they keep having elections, and no party gets anywhere close to 50% of the vote because the vote's spread out among so many different parties. Israel right now has been going through that. They're trying to elect their governments and leaders, and they've had to, I think they're now up to 3 elections because, again, no one can get 50% of the votes, and no one can actually win a majority to form a government. So having a two-party system definitely has its drawbacks. I'm not saying it doesn't, but it does have some advantages in that at least you tend to have winners when you have elections. Another role of political parties is to provide information, some might call it propaganda, to people. This is a lot of times how people become informed of the issues. We talked in our civics duty lecture that one of the duties we have as a citizen in a democracy is to stay informed. But political parties often, help that process. You could argue they hurt in that process in the sense that, maybe they're not giving both sides of the story, but they definitely play a role in that process. And they do that through TV or radio commercials, commercials on the internet. They mail things. If you've ever gone to your mailbox during an election year, you pull it out, and every day you're going to get, one of those laminated, shiny cardboard little flyers for one of the candidates, and have a smiling picture of the candidate along with some bullet points about, their best qualities and that sort of thing. Political parties make phone calls, and generally they just try to let people know about what the key issues are that are going to be at play in the coming election and why people need to get out to vote. So that's a big role they play. And you can argue whether that's good or bad because, again, they're not giving both sides of the story. So would you be better off getting your information from a more neutral site or source than the actual parties? Perhaps, but nonetheless, that is a role they play. And that gets into one of their other purposes, which is simply to win elections. All right? They help operate campaigns. They coordinate their strategies. They coordinate their fundraising. And then they really work to get out the vote. They try to find people who they think agree with their positions and convince those people you need to register to vote, you need to go vote. And in doing that, they really help all their candidates. Like we talked about in our voting lecture, when you go vote, it's not just one race. It's not just for president or governor. There's presidents, governors, senators, House of Representatives. Here in Texas, the agriculture commissioner, the railroad commissioner, state senators. You have many ballots. I'm sorry, many races on a particular ballot. And if a party can get its voters motivated and encouraged to go vote, then that tends to help all of their candidates on their ballot, not just the presidential candidate or the governor. It's called gubernatorial is the correct term for that. Someone running for governor is a gubernatorial candidate. And parties, by getting people out to vote for those big ticket elections, tend to help everybody what we call down ballot. So they really help win elections, or at least they try to. Next, they help run the government. And again, you can argue if this would really be the best system. But once someone comes into office, a president, governor, they have to appoint staff. They have to put people in place to handle the day-to-day running of the country. Because, there are well over 350 million people in our country. I think we always have 50 states, many cities. We have a budget, that we talk about in terms of trillions of dollars. No one person can take care of all of that by themselves. You have to have a huge staff, and it helps or makes it easier for that person trying to run if they have some idea that the people they are appointing have similar views to them. Now, again, you can argue that, surrounding yourself with people with different sort of views would lead to a better decision because you're getting more opinions and more ideas. But there could also be some downsides to that, which is, if a president or governor is trying to implement a certain plan or strategy within the country, within their state, it wouldn't help if the people they've hired to do the job are basically fighting against them. In that effect, nothing would get done because the subordinates, the employees, would be undermining their boss all the time and not getting anything done. And again, you could argue sometimes that would be a good thing. Sometimes, employees may have a better idea than the boss person. and dissenting views can certainly lead to better results sometimes. But just in the day-to-day running, it would make things a little less efficient. So the end result is that when a governor or a president, someone takes office, they can hire people within their own political party that they at least know, okay, this person probably has some similar views as to how the government should operate, or similar views on these key issues as I do. So in that sense, everybody is working in the same direction, and it makes things a little easier to run. Okay, this one gets back to voting. Being a party member, or I'm sorry, yes, being a member of a political party is a signal to voters, theoretically at least, as to what that candidate may believe in and what they don't believe in. We talked during our last lecture about the voting, about straight ticket and straight party voting. And many people do. They go into an election booth, they bubble in one bubble, either Democrat or Republican, theoretically Libertarian or some other party, and that's their vote all the way down. But even the people who don't straight party ticket, they are very much influenced by whether there is an R or a D beside that candidate's name. All right, so when you go on your ballot, and if you're voting for, say, senator, have the person's name, and in parentheses it'll say Republican, or in parentheses it'll say Democrat, and that's a signal to the voter that, okay, we probably can guess about some key things that this person believes in on these key issues, because members of a political party often, not always, but often have similar views on each particular issue. Now I'm going to greatly generalize here, okay? Don't take this as fact on every single issue ever, but I'm going to generalize here. Traditionally, conservatives, that's often associated with Republican candidates, they tend to traditionally want small government. They tend to be a little more pro-business. Conversely, liberals, which are associated with the Democratic Party most often, they traditionally tend to favor a more active government. They tend to favor more workers over businesses. But again, these issues, they change over time, and it's not always quite so cut and dry. For instance, let's talk about tariffs and trade policy. All right, going back in, I'm just going to go back here 30, 40 years. But if you go back to when Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, his son George W. Bush were presidents, the Republican Party tended to be very much pro-trade, for free trade. George H.W. Bush, his administration negotiated NAFTA. Now, it ended up getting passed and signed when Bill Clinton was in office, but the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, negotiated much of NAFTA. That's the North American Free Trade Agreement. That basically meant Mexico, U.S., and Canada were all in a treaty, basically, where businesses in any of those three countries could sell their stuff in the other countries without having to pay tariff or import taxes or export taxes. And generally speaking, Republicans have been the party that promoted free trade, and Democrats were like, no, free trade hurts American workers because companies will move their businesses to other countries where they get cheaper labor, etc. Well, what has happened is over the last several years, those lines have become very blurred. As I said, although George H.W. Bush, his administration negotiated much of NAFTA, it was ultimately signed by Clinton. Barack Obama negotiated something called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, I believe, is the exact name. And that was a sort of a similar free trade agreement with Asian countries. And now he was a Democrat, but he was negotiating this free trade agreement. But it ended up not passing because while presidents get to negotiate treaties, the Senate has to ratify them. And the Senate, that was made up of Republicans, wouldn't ratify that treaty. Although, interestingly, it wasn't necessarily split along party lines. A lot of Democrats who have traditionally been against free trade wouldn't support President Obama on that, even though he was a Democrat, where he did get some support from the Republican Party. However, Donald Trump, who's a Republican, one of his big arguments in campaign mantras was, I'm not going to enter into this free trade agreement with Asian countries. We need to redo NAFTA. And so he took an issue against free trade, which Republican voters had typically been against. That sounds weird. They were against being against free trade. In other words, he took a position opposite to what many Republican voters over the past 20 or 30 years had professed to believe in, and yet he still gets elected with these Republican voters. But part of what got him elected is a lot of people, particularly in the Midwest, who had traditionally voted Democrat and voted Democrat on these top issues that they thought Democrats protected, American factory workers and such. They switched and voted Republican for Trump because he had taken this free trade issue and really been somewhat different than past Republican presidents. So that's a lot of detail. I'm not going to quiz you on the intricacies of each candidate's trade and free trade policy. But it is to show that while I put these generalizations out here that, conservatives tend to be this, liberals tend to be that, these are things that, over time can change, and they may change from issue to issue. There are certainly issues where perhaps Democrats want smaller government interference, and Republicans may want a little more active government on particular issues, even though that really goes against kind of what their traditional core beliefs are. So these issues do change. It's not static, and we're talking about generalizations most of the time. But with all of that being said, those party names on that ballot still gives a signal to voters as to certain ideas and certain beliefs that the candidate probably has, because it'd be really hard to investigate and research the political beliefs of every issue for every candidate. Like I say, there may be 50 candidates on a ballot. There may be 20 issues discussed in any election year. Well, if I'm doing the math in my head correctly, I think that's about 1,000 different positions people would have to research to figure out which candidate thinks about which particular issue. Well, no one has the time for that. That's practically impossible to do. So by grouping themselves into political parties, the voters have a shorthand version of like, okay, they're a Democrat. They probably believe a certain way on this issue that's important to me. Okay, well, that candidate's a Republican. They probably believe a different way on this particular issue. All right. Lastly, political parties give people a chance to participate. Now, very few people are actually going to run for office, but some still may want to participate in the in the political process more than just voting. And parties do give people a chance because they organize at the local level people that can help candidates, whether it's through making phone calls, whether it's walking door to door, whether it's being a delegate at the actual nominating convention. So by joining a political party and by basically kind of signing up at the party level that you're willing to volunteer, the parties can help coordinate that effort and get people involved. Because people could always just decide, okay, well, I want to help this particular candidate, that particular candidate, and they can do that. But again, there are dozens and dozens of candidates running for dozens and dozens of office each and every election. It'd be hard if each of those candidates had to go out and find their own volunteers individually. So the party can help connect candidates to people who want to volunteer for that particular party. So it gives people a chance to participate in the political process more than just voting, but less than actual running for office themselves. Okay, I told you this one would be shorter. The next one, I'm not sure how short it's going to be, but at least this one will be short because that's all I'm going to say about political parties. Next time, we're going to talk about government's role. Again, this is a lecture that we started the year with, and so now when we're towards the end of the year, we're going to come full circle, and that will be the next lecture that I'll put up.